Alright, this is the lecture for chapter 36. It's on population ecology. So just as an introduction, the individual emperor penguins, these are going to be animals that live in the Antarctic climate, which is going to be extremely cold. And in order to survive that, they have a couple of adaptations that have worked for them over the years. One of the things is they have a downy underlayer of feathers for insulation, and then they have a thick layer of fat for energy storage and insulation. The entire population of the emperor penguins are all going to reflect these group characteristics, and that includes survivorship of the chicks and the growth rate of the population. So population ecologists study the natural population. They look at the population structure and dynamics. So a lot of what will be done is looking at a lot of graphs and diagrams in helping to understand population structure and dynamics over time. So if you remember from the other day, a population is a group of individuals of just a single species that live in the same area. When you have this, they're all going to have to rely on the same resources. They're going to be influenced by the same things in the environment, and they're also going to be likely to find their mates in that area as well as interact with others of their species in that area. So you can have the same species live in another area, but when they aren't living in the same area, they're not considered a population. So populations can be described by the number of the individuals and also looking at the distribution. When you're looking at the dynamics of the population, you're going to look at how they interact with biotic factors, which are living factors, and abiotic factors that are non-living factors. These things are all going to influence the population size. Population ecology likes to study the changes in the population size and factors that are going to regulate or control that over time. Populations are either going to increase or decrease. They increase through birth and immigration into an area, and they decrease through death and emigration out of an area. The population density is going to be the number of individuals of a species per unit area or volume. So a couple of examples: the number of oak trees per square kilometer in the forest, the number of earthworms per cubic meter in forest soil. One of the virtual labs that you're going to be doing, you're going to be looking at the population of flowers in an area and measuring that using random sampling. So when you're looking at population density, ecologists have to have ways of estimating the population densities. So within the population's geographic range, local densities may vary greatly. You have to look at the dispersion pattern and looking at how they are spaced within their area. So they can either be clumped, uniform, or random. So when you see a clumped pattern, where you have groups of organisms living in certain areas but they're not evenly dispersed, usually it's going to indicate that the resources are unequally distributed because they generally hang around food. So you'll see your individuals grouped in patches, often around the food. So this is showing a clump distribution of sea stars here at a low tide. With uniform patterns, the individuals are going to be equally spaced out in the environment. A lot of times the reason is they're going to be interacting in a way of having to compete for the resources, so they're better off to be more spread out so that everybody can get a larger share of the resources. So this is showing a uniform dispersion of sunbathers. And then the little circle here is showing a uniform dispersion of organisms on a petri dish. When you have a random pattern of dispersion, the individuals in the population are spaced in an unpredictable way. So this is showing some dandelions with a random dispersion pattern. So survivorship is something that is studied in ecology, and we use life tables to track this. And it's looking at the chances of an individual in a given population surviving to various ages. And when you do this, you're going to have survivorship curves where you're going to plot the survivorship as the proportion of individuals from an initial population, ages, and look at how many are still alive at each age. So you'll be creating some survivorship curves when you do the lab with the information from the cemetery, the demography lab. There's three main types of survivorship curves: type 1, type 2, and type 3. So this is just looking at here a life table for the population, age interval 0 to 10, 10 to 20, 20 to 30, 30 to 40, etc. in 10-year increments, and looking at the number alive at the start of the interval, how many died during the interval. And then your chance of surviving is calculated by taking 1 minus d over n. So what is your chance of being alive at that interval? So you have a 99% chance of being alive between the 0 and age 10 interval. Another thing we look at is the rate of population increase or decrease. The increase under ideal conditions is called exponential growth, and it can be calculated using the exponential growth model. There's an equation that is used to represent this, where G is the growth rate of the population, N is the population size, and R is the rate per capita of increase. So the equation is G equals R times N. You want to think of this as being used more as an equation to explain the relationship. You're not actually going to be doing any of these calculations in class. Eventually, though, populations can't go on growing exponentially forever. One or more limiting factors is going to start to restrict the population growth. So this is showing population growth of rabbits increasing here. You've got the population size on the y-axis and then the time on the x-axis. And this is just the individual data points that would be plotted on that. So the logistic growth model is a description of an idealized population growth that is slowed by limiting factors such as the population size as it increases. So the logistic growth model has a different formula for exponential growth. The Rn is multiplied by an expression that describes the effect of limiting factors on the increase in population size. So you're going to add an additional factor in here, K, that stands for carrying capacity, which is the maximum population size a particular environment can sustain. So I'm going to see if I can get this to scoot up a little bit more so you can actually see the whole equation. So here your growth is going to equal Rn times K minus N over K. Again, this is an equation that you look at in terms of explaining the relationship, not that you're going to actually be calculating any of these numbers. So this is showing a different type of growth curve here. You can see it increases, but then it also reaches a point where it stabilizes. So where that actually stabilizes would be considered the carrying capacity. So this is showing here where you've got a J-shaped growth curve and a little bit more of an S-shaped growth curve. And again, this is the data points that are on the table. So logistic growth models predict that population growth will slow and eventually stop as the population density increases. And that's a lot more realistic than thinking that you're going to have unlimited growth for an unlimited amount of time. So at increasing population density, density-dependent rates are going to result in declining births and increasing deaths. You're going to have fewer of the species born, and you're going to have more of them dying as you start to have the population become too dense. So when we have competition between individuals, we can have intraspecific and you can have interspecific. With intraspecific, the competition is between the individuals of the same species for limited resources. So this is going to be a density-dependent factor that would limit growth in that natural population. Some of these types of factors could include the amount of food and nutrients, their ability to find a safe place to hide, an area to nest and breed. All are important and would be influenced by the number of individuals in that population. In many natural populations, abiotic factors such as weather may affect the population size well before you get to the density-dependent factors. So the density-independent factors are unrelated to population density. These include a lot of things like natural disasters such as fire, storms, habitat destruction, seasonal changes in weather. So for example, with aphids, you're going to see them peak in the summer months, and then when it cools off again, they're going to die back down. These don't care how many are in a population. If the habitat is going to be destroyed, it's going to destroy everything that lives in there. It doesn't matter if there's 3 or 30 in there. They're all destroyed. So this is showing here with the number of aphids. So they are growing, they peak in the summer, then when things start to decline, you're going to see a very sudden decline in the populations. So some populations are actually going to have cycles where they're going to fluctuate with some regularity. So you would see some boom and bust cycles. These can be due to food shortages or predator-prey interactions. So here you can see a comparison between the hare population and the lynx population. So as you have the snowshoe hare go up, you're going to have more lynx that are going to catch them. Just as the lynx has started to eat several of the hares, then you're going to have the hare population decrease, and then there's not enough food for all of the lynx, so their population is going to decrease. So they will fluctuate in cycle, and they are also related and dependent on each other. So the traits that affect an organism's schedule of reproduction and death make up its life history. And some key life history traits include the age of first reproduction, how frequent they reproduce, the number of offspring, and the amount of parental care. Generally, what you will see is the more parental care that is required of the offspring, the fewer offspring the species will have. So for humans, we require a lot of parental care. We've got, on average, I guess legally, we have 18 years, probably a little bit more, of caring for an offspring. We also have relatively few offspring. Where some animals are born almost independent, they're able to walk and feed themselves within a few days, you're going to see a lot more offspring there because they will move away from their parents much more quickly. So for practical applications, we try to have sustainable resource management, and this should apply to how we harvest crops, eliminate damage to natural resources, and overall manage any of our lands. So an example would be the cod fishery off of Newfoundland. This was overfished and it collapsed in 1992, and it still is not recovered. It's going to take a long time for that to recover because the resources were not well managed. So resource managers use the population ecology as a basis to determine what are sustainable yields. So this is just showing the yields in thousands of metric tons of the cod. And you can see that they were high, they've gone way, way down and stayed low. So when we look at the human population, it grew rapidly during the 20th century, and currently it stands at about 7 billion. And growth of the human population is not equal in all parts of the world. So this is showing the human population overall on the entire planet. And then this is the projected here that it's actually going to decrease a little bit. So our rate of increase is slowing, or the rate of growth is slowing. So it's a demographic transition, a shift from high birth rates and death rates to low birth rates and death rates. And it has lowered the rate of growth in developed countries as well. So here in the blue you can see the birth rate, here in the red you can see the death rate, And where there's a bigger separation, that's the rate of increase. So in developing nations, we're finding that death rates have dropped. The birth rates are still high, so these populations are growing rapidly. So this is just a comparison of birth rates and death rates overall in the world. More developed nations, less developed nations. So the age structure of a population is important. It also helps to predict the future of the population. The age structure is the proportion of individuals in different age groups, and that will affect future growth of the population. So population momentum is the continued growth that occurs. This is despite reduced fertility, and as a result of the girls in the 0 to 14 age group of a previously expanding population reaching their childbearing years. So when those girls go into their childbearing years, you know you're going to see an increase in the population. So this is just showing some different patterns for population growth in humans. And this just shows the tables a little bit larger. So age structure is also going to be tied to social and economic trends. A lot of times it's going to reveal the population's growth trends and social conditions. So this is looking at some populations in different time intervals and their growth patterns. So again, a little bit larger versions. So one of the reasons that we look at this is an ecological footprint will be formed. It's a measure of the resource consumption. So the U.S. Census Bureau projects a global population of 8 billion people within the next 20 years and 9.5 billion by the mid-21st century. So the question becomes, do we have sufficient resources on this planet to sustain 8 or 9 billion people? So to accommodate all the people expected to live on our planet by 2025, the world would have to double its current food production. So the ecological footprint is the estimate of the amount of land required to provide the raw materials an individual or a nation consumes. With the raw materials, we mean food, fuel, water, housing, and waste disposal. So the United States has a very large ecological footprint. It's much greater than its own land, and it's running on a large ecological deficit. So some researchers estimate that if everyone on Earth had the same standard of living as people living in the United States, we would need the resources of 4.5 planet Earths. So one of the things, if you have lived in other countries, we tend to have much larger houses than a lot of other countries. Our homes are much larger than in Europe, where they have bigger populations. And with a bigger home comes more resources that are needed. That's just one example of how the United States has a larger ecological footprint. So here's a comparison of home in a third world country versus a fancy home in the United States. Granted, there are plenty of people in the United States who certainly don't live to the standard shown in that picture. And it looks like they have everything from their house in their yard. So this picture here uses different colors to compare the ecological footprints per capita. And so the dark red is the greatest. The ones that are white, it doesn't mean they aren't using anything. This kind of whitish gray color just means there's insufficient data to put accurate numbers on here. So biggest houses here, here in Europe, smaller, and then throughout South America, Central America, Africa, much smaller ecological footprint. Australia is a little bit lower, not quite as high.